Well, good morning. Welcome to the League of Women Voters Forum, League Day Forum, the first 2,000 days for the first states, first learners. What we know, what we can do. It's co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Delaware and the American Association of University Women, AAUW of Delaware. Today, you will hear an overview of early childhood care and education in Delaware, as well as the impact of COVID on the industry, and we'll discuss what we can do about it. My name is Christine Galeen. I'm president of AAUW Delaware and League of Women Voters Education Portfolio member. Penny Diner, League of Women Voter Education Portfolio member and Public Policy Chair of AAUW Delaware, and I are very pleased to introduce Madeline Baird of Rodell, Chair of the Delaware Early Childhood Council, along with Neil Kirschling, also from Rodell, who will be sharing information and leading our discussion. Please put any questions you have in the chat. And right now, welcome, Madeline, take it away.
Good morning. Thank you so much to the League and AAUW for focusing on this important topic. And I'm just going to give a very brief landscape and turn it over to the excellent panelists that you have here to tell you about what this looks like on the ground, because they're the ones that work with the kids every day. So just a couple of the organizations represented here. Christine mentioned, we are both with Rodell. I chair the Early Childhood Council. We have some members of that on the line today, as well as some members of our advocacy group First State Pre-K, which both host organizations are members of. And Neil will be sharing some ways to get involved with that organization and some upcoming events to continue the conversation. So really excited. Thank you again for having us. And just to do a very, kind of little bit 50,000 foot, 30,000 foot, and then we can get down to 10,000 foot. The next slide is just a little bit about, why do we care about this topic? Many of you know the research over the last few decades that have really shown the brain science about the early years, and also the economic evidence that every dollar invested before kindergarten yields one of the biggest returns, something like $10 or $13 to 1 for society. So whether you're talking with a policymaker that cares about criminal justice reform, they care about special education, they care about third grade reading, they care about more people contributing taxes to the economy and not relying on public assistance. There are studies that show that early childhood contributes to all of those. So very compelling evidence. We've tried to sum it up here. There's a lot more on the First State Pre-K website, but just to start with a little bit of why should we care? And then the next slide is just, who are we talking about? What are we talking about? Where are we talking about? So when we say early care and education, childcare in Delaware is funded from birth to 12 years old. So it can be all day care for young kids or before, after, and summer care for school age kids. And it really ranges from, the basic licensed care that's required by the state. In other words, keep your bleach at a certain height, have a certain number of kids per adults in the room. All the way up to a more high quality environment, excuse me, with higher standards for the staff, like certifications and teaching degrees, program and curriculum standards, and smaller ratios. And these can exist across a scattershot of locations. You have some of these on the phone today or on the Zoom today. A child care center, I think Sean from Beach Babies is here. We have Audrey from Indian River School District and Jamie, who is a small business. So you really have a range of funding streams and of settings to be able to serve kids, which is one of the challenges, to be honest, because it makes it difficult for families to access and to know, what do I qualify, where do I go? I always use the example of my third grade son, who you may have seen on the Zoom a few minutes ago. He is entitled to a public education. I don't know how that's paid for, and I don't have to apply separately for Title I and local funds and IDEA. He's entitled to that education. And that's sort of the vision that we want to get to, so that it's not this scattershot. Do I qualify for Head Start? Do I qualify for state subsidy? Do I qualify for pre-K kind of scenario that we're in now? So just want to give a little bit of a landscape of what are we talking about? Who is served? We mentioned, families. Most families today who have kids have their parents in the workforce. So the brain science and the current state of our society are telling us that this is something we should do and that we need to kind of catch up with. We have a number in poverty, and some of those do qualify for public assistance, but it's not necessarily an easy process. And poverty is not a static state. So we're trying to move, the country is trying to move toward more of what other countries do in terms of investing in this for all children. We know it's really expensive for families who don't qualify for those public assistance. We were told that before COVID, we were told by parents that there's some way they're not growing the economy because of the cost of childcare. They're not having another child, they're not buying a house, they're not going back to school, they're not taking a job. And we know, and you'll hear more from the panel, that COVID has only exacerbated this challenge. It's very hard to find care, and women have dropped out of the workforce. We have the lowest women's workforce participation since the 80s right now, in part due to childcare. Talking about who's in these childcare centers, mostly women, a lot of women of color, and for that basic childcare that I mentioned, the requirements are very minimal, a high school degree plus some community training. Now, some of the programs you'll hear from today have those higher standards of degrees and higher requirements for training, but what we see is the wages are so low that it's very hard to recruit and retain people who have higher degrees. If we can only pay minimum wage because the state rate is so low, it's very hard to keep people and to compete with the K-12 system or even Amazon or Costco. So we see a workforce here who many of them rely on public assistance themselves. And that's certainly not the picture we want to paint for one of the most important industries for our society and for the foundation of our education system. So just a little bit of context there. And I think I'm now going to talk about sort of what's the state of the field. Some of you know about this strategic plan that's here that we released. This is sort of our guiding document for the state. We are excited. We have a stock take that we can share. I'll find the link to that and put it in the chat. But basically, what's the progress that's been made over the last year toward this plan? A lot of the progress has been led by legislators, which is exciting, on everything from increasing pre-K to changing the way that we pay early educators to developmental screening. So we have a lot of good allies and champions in the legislature. We now have a new associate secretary who starts next week in the Department of Education. Her name's Caitlin Gleason, and she helped develop this plan. She's a great asset, an ally, former teacher herself, systems thinker. So very excited to work with Caitlin. I think I have linked here a blog that I did on the governance of early childhood. So just Christine asked me to speak a little bit about kind of who are the players at the state level. And Caitlin is in the Department of Education. Early childhood is spread across multiple agencies with multiple funding streams and regulations. So one thing that this plan calls for that we're looking forward to working more on is kind of bringing those funding streams and regulations together. I'm sure Audrey can talk about the number of different and sometimes conflicting regulations that she has to navigate. So we're trying to make this as easy on families and on providers as possible. And right now we make it very difficult. So governance is certainly one of the things that other states have looked at that we're certainly focused on. Just to speak to some of the momentum underway. And again, you'll hear more about kind of how to get involved and what's going on the ground. But through the ACLU lawsuit that some of you know about, the governor did commit to increasing funding for pre-K, as well as the Reading Consortium has committed some funds for increases in the city of Wilmington. So that had not happened since pre-K was created in Delaware in the 90s when Senator Carper was governor. And nobody was really talking about it until our First State Pre-K Coalition really got it on the agenda. So thanks to all of you who have been a part of that. The other piece we're working on is child care subsidy. Right now, we fund a very small amount of kids at a very low rate, which makes it not desirable as a program for providers to be a part of, and then they can't pay staff, and then they can't offer the slots to families. So we're working on increasing that rate that the state pays for child care subsidy. And right now there is $11.5 million in the budget that the governor recommended, but it is not permanent money and it's not as large as we need it to be. So that's really the advocacy that Jamie and Neil can speak more to. And just to say again, thank you to all of you and to our policymakers who've been great partners on this. I think there's a lot of momentum underway, a lot of opportunity here, and you have some great leaders on the panel here. So Christine, anything you hoped I would cover or that we should add here?
No, I think you've covered it very well, Madeline. Thank you. I did want to, if you could put it in the chat, a resource for First State Pre-K, so people could access that as my favorite group to belong to. I would appreciate that.
I can also
Excellent.
make sure to share the entire slides afterwards with any links in here.
Okay, good. Wonderful. We would like that because we'd like to post this on our both organizations' websites.
Thank you. Yes, you can sign up at the link that Neil mentioned, and under resources, there are a number of.
Madeline, I did have one other question that maybe you could just take a moment to talk about. The associate secretary's role. Can you tell us, that was added several years ago by the governor, signed off on that through legislation. And we had someone in that position and they left. Now we have Caitlin. What do you see that doing for childcare in Delaware and early education? That office.
Yep. So, I mean, the opportunity that Caitlin has, I think, is to bring together a number of competing, sometimes conflicting regulations and funding streams. So, for example, right now, the child care subsidy program is separate from the incentive funds that programs get if they meet a higher requirement, is separate from our state pre-K program, is separate from a pre-K program in the city. In the vision that we have is really that all those funding streams are behind the scenes. Families don't, and providers don't need to be mired in each one and who qualifies for each one and which thing is paying for which part of this kid's day. It would be more of a system, like I mentioned, like K-12. So I think that's the big opportunity, is to make things easier and more streamlined for families and providers, and to bring together some things. So this blog that's linked here talks about how Delaware has moved a few different pieces of, of the system together under DOE childcare licensing together with our quality initiatives. There's more opportunity there to integrate it though, so it's the same system rather than, I'm a provider today, I have a STARS TA coming out tomorrow, I have a licensing specialist, and then the next day I have ECAP monitoring. So big opportunity to bring all that together. I think I see that Caitlin is here. So welcome and congratulations, and very exciting that she's taking on this position, and she's welcome to add anything I missed here. So really excited. We have a great leader and great opportunity here. And I think the next couple of slides are just a little bit about sort of the current state, and flesh out a little bit what I mentioned that you'll hear from here. Very challenging recruiting and retaining staff in the industry. In large part because of the low salaries. They're making about a third of what K-12 educators make and don't have those benefits or paid time off. We have shortages of childcare because the wages are so low that it's hard to hire people. And then if you can't hire people, you can't serve students. And then so we have families being turned away, and the providers on the call can talk about waiting lists. When you tell a family of an infant, you're number 300 on the waiting list, maybe there's hope that when the child's 4, they might get in. So it's really not a waiting list. It's more of a, sorry, you can't have this service. So, and I mentioned the workforce participation and the, cost of care. So just a little bit more about kind of, this was a crisis and we had shortages before the pandemic, but those words are certainly not hyperbole now that we've been through the last couple of years. And this just paints the picture that, if the state continues to invest at a similar rate and not increase, costs go up. They're going up in every industry, but they were already, we were already making ends meet by paying people minimum wage. It basically means that we can serve fewer kids. And so just to paint the picture here, we know we're serving fewer kids than we have in the past because of the low rate, and we're employing fewer workers. So just to paint the picture of kind of where we are today, and you'll hear lots more of this from the panel, but I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. That was terrific. Can I ask you one more question?
Absolutely.
Because I know you have to go. A lot of people think that we're going to get federal money, and that's going to solve all the problems. And you wrote a terrific article about how that's not going to solve Delaware's problems. Could you do like a 1-minute thing on that? And Neil, can you link that blog?
The opportunity of whatever happens from Build Back Better, whether it's a different bill or a chopped up Build Back Better or whatever happens, is huge. And the benefit of it is it would catalyze state investment. So for example, what we saw when we got a big federal grant a few years ago, the state made a big investment in tiered incentives. And that would happen again. Even if we get even if we can serve all kids in universal pre-K because of Biden's proposal, there is still going to be a state match for that. There will still need to be training for teachers. There will still need to be facilities. So the switch cannot be flipped overnight. The state's going to have to build the infrastructure just like it had to when we developed kindergarten and full day kindergarten. And we don't often see federal programs that cover 100% of the cost. I mean, in K-12, the feds cover a very small percentage of the cost, for example. So yes, it's a great catalyst. It's exciting. If you're talking to the federal delegation, please encourage them to keep this as a priority. And we need, as a state, to step up sort of regardless of what the feds do. And in anticipation of what the feds do, we want to be able to benefit from those resources. And if we don't have the capacity to offer pre-K, the facilities, the infrastructure, the workforce, we won't be able to take as much advantage of those resources either. So it's a both and.
Okay, thank you. I want to make
Absolutely.
sure
Thank
people
you.
heard that. Yeah, because that's often we'll just wait for a build back, not so better, or whatever it's going to be called.
Right. Thank you again.
You're welcome. Thank
And we
you.
can field additional questions. That's right, Christine, at the end and after we bring our
Yeah.
panelists in so they can also help contribute to that. Perfect. Well, I'm happy to kick off the next portion. I have the pleasure of just moderating a great panel. And without further ado, I'd love for them to introduce themselves. Audrey, and then Sean, and then Jamie, would you mind sharing with the group who you are, what organization you're with, and the types of children and families that you serve?
Hi there, I'm Audrey Carey. I'm the supervisor of early learning for the Indian River School District, and we serve children in our walls, actually starting at the age of 2, 3, 4, until they transition from kindergarten. And we work with various funding sources, as we can certainly discuss later, but everything from ECAP funding to tuition, where we charge, to even unit count. So working within those structures. And we certainly are recently super partnering with our community childcares, which we need in this world to provide itinerant services. Happy to be here today.
And can you define itinerant services, Audrey, for the group that might not know what that means?
And that can look at different ways depending on the district or who you partner with, but essentially where we're really big on focusing on providing early learning in a child's natural learning environment where they learn best. And some of that doesn't happen to be in a district walls of a traditional school. It could be in a high quality childcare. So we might send out support services such as speech therapies, occupational therapies, a teacher to help partner and serve that child in the best way possible.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Sean, could you introduce yourself, please, and describe who you serve?
Morning. Thank you for having me. My name is Sean Turner. I'm the owner and president of Beach Babies Childcare. We have 4 locations throughout Delaware in Townsend, Lewis, Roebuck, and Milford. We serve children 6 weeks through 12 years old, offering before and after school summer camp programs, as well as a full day infant through pre-K program. We work with school districts such as Indian River, Cape Philippian School District, help getting children all the support services that we need. And we focus mainly on education first. We're specifically working with pre-K readiness programs, making sure that the children within our program have everything they need. So when they enter the school program, they are prepared and ready to go into college and beyond.
Thank you, Sean. And Jamie, can you round us out?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Neil. I'm thrilled to be here today. My name's Jamie Schneider. I am the president of the Delaware Association for the Education of Young Children. We are an advocacy and support nonprofit for children birth to 8. And we also incorporate the Early Childhood Task Force, which started as the Early Childhood COVID Task Force, which we are just continuing as a way to meet provider needs and make sure provider voices are heard. I'm also the owner and operator of the Educational Enrichment Center located in North Wilmington. We serve families birth through 5. During the pandemic, we increased that to 12 because we had to have a virtual learning environment for our families who needed childcare for school age kiddos who were unable to attend in person.
Yeah, thank you. So the way I'd like to run this is I'm going to ask a few starting questions for Audrey, Jamie, and Sean, have them weigh in on the importance of early education, sort of the state of the field, the state of the workforce, and a little bit more detail on purchase of care specifically. And then after that, would love to field questions that Christine and others can moderate from the chat. So if you have questions as we go, or if you already have questions on things Madeline said, please drop them in the chat. We'll get to them at the end. But really, we'll defer to our conversation starters here, and Sean, Jamie, and Audrey. Audrey, do you mind starting us off? What we heard Madeline say is that one of the reasons there is early child education is to prepare students to enter the K-12 system. And so, can you talk a little bit about the children you see enter your doors? What the impact is of a high quality early learning experience before they even enter kindergarten?
Sure, and you're also going to hear me, I believe, reiterate a lot of what Madeline says, which is a good thing, because I think for the first time in Delaware, we're starting to really talk the same talk. So that's years in the making. And so you're hearing educators, politicians, parents, and they're all talking about our state and search for the best educational opportunities for our youngest and our smallest citizens. We talk about the importance of early childhood education, and it can't be overstated. Madeline mentioned about a large part of that whole critical to brain development in children happening before start of kindergarten, and how this even impacts their school performance and their lifelong social skills. And reaching these students early to provide the possible earliest intervention is what we can do, and simply said, provides the necessary supports for them for a lifetime to come. However, with that said, I think that it's important that although we know all this wonderful research, that in Delaware, we're envisioning something very different in early learning, not simply mirroring a kindergarten through 12 grade school setting. We want to create a strong foundation of high quality programming where children with childcare, our community agencies, parents, school districts, because we can't do it alone, create the healthiest start for all of our children. And some of those things we've talked about in the past and worked on is even providing high quality developmental vision, hearing, literacy screenings that's accessible to all children. A Healthy Start would provide early intervention and recreational therapies for students that would be in highly trained early childhood programs with those professionals, and focusing on a program that begins at birth all the way until grade 3, not just simply kindergarten. And we also embrace a sustained system for improvement where we're reflecting and working with our practitioners and legislators to develop that early learning. So we hear a lot of push for universal pre-K, and we're excited about that, but we also want to make sure that we don't forget why we went in this, for early intervention and find the best pieces. So I think in Delaware right now, we have an early learning system that's going to really work to provide the strongest foundation to embrace all children in an authentic way. And I can't wait to begin that work with the partners on the screen.
Yeah, Audrey, you brought up a few great points. So pre-K, for those who don't know, ages 3 and 4 typically, correct? So when we talk about early care and education, right, we're trying to also reflect our infants and our school-age children too that need additional care. And Audrey, it's accurate to say that the earlier you can identify students that have those additional sort of needs, the better off we're setting them up for success in the future. Is that right? Like if you wait until 3rd grade to identify these needs, sometimes it can cost more or even sort of be later in their development than what's needed for their growth.
Absolutely. I mean, our goal is to actually provide that early intervention, get them to what they need to. So in kindergarten, they start on that even foundation. I think with that said, the younger that you work with children, the harder that is to balance between over-identification and just providing them with an educational setting where they just need an extra support. So that's why it's essential in this to work with so many agencies, not just a school district, but with parents and childcare and specialists to make sure that we do it right.
Yeah. Jamie or Sean, anything you would add to just sort of the overall importance of early education, what we know about kids before we start move into the impact of COVID?
I just wanted to highlight, and I want to thank Audrey for highlighting in this, that we really are looking at this in a holistic manner of how can we create services, settings, and environments and programs and opportunities for children and families that best suits the child and family's needs. So that a lot of times you'll hear the term mixed delivery system. And right now, currently in Delaware, we have family child care providers, we have center-based for-profit centers, we have nonprofit centers, we have community-based organizations, and we have school districts that are providing childcare and early care and education. And I think it's super important that we remember that families pick those settings for reasons that best fit their family's needs, and that it is of the utmost importance that we continue to support families in doing that. And as Audrey said, no one can do it alone, and we need to work together to create those supports and those environments for the children.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jamie. And thank you for those leaving questions in the chat. We'll definitely circle back to those at the end. I want to move us on to, I think one of the reasons we started this panel was to really analyze the impact that COVID has had on the landscape here in Delaware. Madeline mentioned we were sort of experiencing challenges in terms of cost and access and quality before the pandemic. So I really want to hear from, perhaps we can start with you, Sean, since we haven't brought you in yet, what the impact of COVID has been on the families that you serve and your ability as a provider to serve them. And then Audrey or Jamie, feel free to piggyback off of Sean.
Yeah, COVID has impacted our centers in multiple ways. Kind of just kicking it back to 2020, when COVID first hit, we initially closed for about 69 days. Well, when we reopened, a lot of as you all know, the parents couldn't enter the building. So it really put a lot of strain on our teachers and our administrators to be able to provide and get the children from the front door to the teachers, to the classroom, gathering all their stuff. And it also put a huge undue strain on the parents, especially the first-time parents, who were then putting their children in care where they might have not been able to see the center, see the classrooms, meet the teachers. So it put a lot of trust into the parent, into the child care providers, who are then just kind of watching your children. There are a lot of other impacts within COVID. Since 2020, our costs have risen 35%. It now costs nearly $60 per day per child to watch a child within our center. And all that costs have been, unfortunately, been passed down to the parents because we haven't been receiving the same type of support that we need. We have been getting the subsidized fund, we've been getting grants within the state, but a lot of that money, as Jamie can piggyback off this in a little bit, has been spent already within bonuses to our teachers to recruit, retain, and get equipment. Just as a quick example, we're building our Milford Center for fencing for our playground, which is required by the state. It went up 38% cost within 6 months. And for a childcare center to be able to incorporate that kind of cost, it's impossible, being that most childcare centers, their profits for the year averages maybe 3 to 5%. Over the course of a typical year, the gross revenue of a childcare center just for payroll can account to 65% of the gross revenue that we're bringing in. So it doesn't leave a whole lot of money that we can continue to invest. And COVID just impacted all of this and amplified it. The staffing issues that we've been going through have been an issue forever. But a lot of women, particularly single women, single moms, have been leaving the industry in masses. As Madeline said earlier, women are leaving the workforce industry in record numbers, and we cannot just continue to support and get the quality support that we need to continue to care for the children.
Sean, you brought up an interesting point about having to pass on costs to private paying families. And if costs are rising for care, I think we can all imagine what impact that has on equity and who can afford to have access to care, just to put a finer point on that.
Yeah, we've lost a lot of low income and purchase of care subsidized families. Prior to COVID, we were probably about 35 to 45% purchase of care. In our Lewis location, our Rehoboth was about 65%. In our Townsend, we averaged about 40%, but now we're about half of that, which then also impacts our subsidy rate for our child adult care food program. We provide food and everything like that for all the children's breakfast, lunch, and afternoon snack. Well, because of the low income families that are no longer there, we're not even getting the full reimbursement rates for the food. So we're actually losing money every time we provide a meal for a child.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for sharing that. For those that don't know, just to define the term Sean used, purchase of care is a state subsidy for child care services that is provided through the state for families that qualify based on their income threshold and their. It was initially a workforce program. There's also need to be seeking some sort of employment. And you'll hear, I think, us talk about that a few times because it's one of the places we'd really like to see some change this year. Providers are being reimbursed at such low levels that, like Sean said, they are losing funding basically for each student that they serve sometimes. Jamie or Audrey, I'd love to bring you into the conversation too about the impact that COVID has had on the families that you serve and your ability to serve them.
I would like to say that I do think, as much as we talk about the negative ramifications of COVID, and they are extensive, I hope Audrey agrees with this. I think one of the benefits of COVID has been increased communication between school districts and childcare providers throughout the state. And that has been a hurdle and a boundary that we've been trying to break and overcome for almost a decade that I've been doing this, so probably longer. And I think that that is one of the huge silver linings, is that there is much more collaboration, communication, and understanding between the districts and childcare providers. I would reiterate everything that Sean said, but I would also mention that the impact of COVID on families has been, the social emotional toll that COVID has taken, not just on the workforce of childcare centers, because that is talked about a lot, but we are the number one support for families. We become their sounding board, their guide, their mentor, because for a lot of families, this is the first child that they've had. And it is not the first child that we have taken care of. So they look to us. And during COVID, more so than ever, I think parents have felt parental guilt for working during a pandemic when they feel like maybe it's not the safest choice for them to have their child in childcare, that they'd like to work less hours. And now, as we see the workforce returning to in-person working environments, it is becoming a very large challenge for parents because a lot of companies are not being flexible upon their return. And we still have pretty strict and strong guidelines that, I believe most centers in the state are choosing to follow to keep COVID down. It's not gone. It's not going away. We will continue to deal with it in an endemic fashion versus a pandemic. But I think it's important to realize that the stress levels that everyone is facing is somewhat passed on to childcare providers and schools during this time. We have been a consistent and safe place for families and children. And I think that that's one of the reasons that we won't see, or we'll see maybe a reduced mental health crisis in a few years, is that children who have been in childcare and in school have a consistent day-to-day pattern, and they are with people that they trust, which is just something we know in the first 5 years is absolutely important for their development. I think the other thing to mention in just what has the impact of COVID been on families, we have seen a significant reduction across the state in centers being able to offer infant and toddler care, whether it is private pay or those receiving purchase of care. We're looking at probably around 26% of infant and toddler slots have shut down throughout the state. And that's twofold. One, the purchase of care reimbursement rate is lower for infant and toddler care than it is for doggy daycare if you were to send your child or send your dog to doggy daycare, it costs more to do that than the state reimburses for childcare. So just something to think about. The second thing is it costs significantly more to have a infant and toddler classroom open because of the ratios. So when centers are looking at how can I serve the most families most effectively with a shortage of workforce, it is just unfortunately the choice that they have to make is to close infant and toddler classrooms, leaving families without options for care. And that is what we've seen across the state, is that centers are making a very difficult choice to no longer accept infants and toddlers because the cost of care is skyrocketing so much.
Do you know,
Audrey,
Jamie,
I
what
will.
that ratio
Oh,
is for infant and toddler? To like, can you paint us a picture? Like, how many
sure.
adults to children in a typical infant
Absolutely.
classroom?
So in a licensed child care facility, the ratio for infants is 1 to 4, with a maximum group size of 8. So the most you can have in a classroom of infants or children under 1 is 8 children. When you compare that to 4-year-olds, you can have a maximum group size of 24 with a ratio of 12 to 1. So 2 teachers to 24 children is much different than 2 teachers to 8 children.
Yeah, that really helps illustrate how why the costs are higher, for those young kiddos. Audrey, anything you would add in terms of impact that you've seen COVID on the families and children that you serve?
Well, I think Sean and Jamie, I mean, they couldn't have said it any better between some of the struggle points that we see versus clearly some of the positives. I think I would have to reiterate about the mental health of the children that we see, the children coming to us and the families. I think for a district perspective, that's been, we certainly have supports in place, but really needing to go and look at the whole child and the whole family versus what you typically would do in a kindergarten on-up structure. So reaching out, I think that's where for sure that whole, we've kind of child cares and districts and supporting agencies have always been in isolation. And that's where we've had to, with COVID, come together and make sure that they have those supports. We even did several trainings with our child cares on what that our online systems would look like and what supports we could provide and meet with them. I'm always hesitant to say because I know that we have a lot of work to go, but they're particularly with our child cares and coming together and what that structure would look like. But it certainly has moved mountains for sure, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for adding. I want to drill down into one last thing that Sean said about the workforce. And then after that, Christine and others, I'd love to turn it over to you to take some questions. And then let's leave 10 minutes at the end so we can talk about action. I know that the topic of this panel was like, what's going on? What's the action related to it? And Jamie and I have a preview of an advocacy day coming up, and we'd love to give you some more information about that and purchase of care. So my last question to the panel is specifically about the workforce. Sean, you mentioned it already, but if there's anything more detailed you can provide, like talk us through recruitment, morale, staffing shortage, like what does it really look like at your centers? What are you experiencing?
Overall, the staff morale across childcare in general is down. Teachers are stressed out, they are burnt out, they are overworking, they're working 40+ hours a week because of the low staffing and the staffing issues that we're having. The average childcare worker makes just over $10.50. I believe it's $10.75 now because the minimum wage has increased to $10.50. And we need to increase that. We are losing teachers in droves to other industries. They're leaving to go work at McDonald's, Chick-fil-A, Starbucks, because their starting hourly wages are $13 to $15 an hour. I believe I just read Starbucks is now up to $22 an hour, I believe. And we just
Sean, just as an FYI, McDonald's in Middletown is hiring for $19 an hour with a $2,000 bonus.
Great. And we just can't compete with that. I mean, we're doing $1,000 signing bonuses, we're doing retention bonuses, we're doing recruitment, anything we can to try and get staff in the door. And we just can't get quality staff in the door. We're getting applicants and we're getting lots of applicants, but none of them are qualified to be able to be left alone and work with children for at least a month. Also, childcare licensing recently revised their rule that allows interns to be allowed to be left alone with children after 1 month of working within their center and passing their background check and everything else like that. But high quality childcare centers such as mine, we don't allow that because we know that it's not safe for a young person that only has so little experience to be left alone with children. And we need to focus on getting the high quality teachers within childcare, but not just to recruit them, but to retain them so they stay within this and make it an actual industry where we can support retirement and having them retire within childcare, similar to like how the K through 12 districts do. We can't compete with $40,000 a year, unfortunately. I mean, that would equate to $19.50 an hour. Well, if we're going to charge that, pay that to our teachers, we're looking at $500 a week for an infant. And I don't know any parents that can afford that, especially if you have 2, 3 children.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for connecting all the dots there, Sean, between the workforce and pay for parents. I mean, it's all wrapped up and it's all interconnected and all something we're trying to work towards. I know there's been some great questions in the chat, including from Dorothy, who I love that you're looking at this from an advocacy lens already. Before we get to sort of Advocacy Day and sort of the efforts underway, I want to open it up to any questions that people have for the panel about the current state of childcare industry and their work or anything you've heard so far. So Christy, maybe we can do that. And then with
Sure.
10 minutes left, can switch over to
We do
advocacy
have a
mode.
couple questions. I had some questions that I'll ask my own questions first. I wanted to ask Audrey if she could clarify. She used the phrase authentic way, meeting children's need in an authentic way. I have a sense for what that means, but I was curious, could you expound on what does that actually look like?
And I'm so glad that you asked that because I have to explain it a lot, even at a district perspective. One, we're looking that we have high quality programs, as we talked about, with some structures in place that typically are not in a preschool setting, such as assessment and multi-tiered support systems where we work with children. But it also means, so a lot of times when you hear that, you hear assess kids. But we're talking about ways that children are assessed and they learn naturally. So for example, learning through play, or assessed through play, where we don't look at things from a district perspective as that they have reading and math and art and science. They have those things, but maybe we bring in some additional supports, like we mentioned, for example, the crisis with just mental health. Instead of having gym or physical education, maybe we want to look at more authentic ways where we have the supports of more school counselors that provide those services and outreach to our families. So really looking at not only the research behind how kids learn, but what does that look like, and that it doesn't have to fit this typical mold.
Mm-hmm. Really looking at the whole child.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I had a question also for Jamie and Sean. I love the fact that you talked about reimbursement and the doggy daycare, because in a conversation with Madeline Penny and I were floored when she made that analogy. Sean, could you explain to people exactly how much it costs you for each child that is a purchase of care, how much the center has to pay, in terms of lack of reimbursement?
So we're a purchase of care plus subsidy child care center. So each family pays a little bit different. Each family's a little bit different. So we have some families that pay zero because the state will reimburse us the full amount that we would be typically charged, or at least the full amount that they'll do. And then we have some families that will have to pay, up to $75 or more, depending on the different purchase of care reimbursement rate that we're receiving from the families.
And what does it cost you?
It costs me
to educate a child, any child?
$60 per child per day.
Okay. I think
that's the average based upon each of my different centers. The state average may be different, but within my past 2 years, our cost of childcare per day has increased 35% since 2020.
And Sean's using that, Christine, as an average. So that's not taking into account that his pre-K program may be $50, but the infants are $90.
Correct. They just average across every child, whether it be infant or by school age.
Mhm. Yeah.
I think the other thing that's important to recognize, Christine, too, is currently in Delaware, there's a geographic difference in what providers are paid in their reimbursement rates. So Newcastle County has the highest reimbursement rates, and Kent and Sussex have significantly lower, $15 a day lower in some instances. So right now we are absolutely saying that Kent and Sussex children cost less and are worth less than those in Newcastle are. Where when this program was designed back in, I think it was like 1981, and we were looking at the difference in cost of living in Sussex versus Newcastle, I am sure that there was a distinct difference. However, that difference has been eliminated. There is, a gallon of milk costs the same as it does in Milford that it does in Middletown. And those differences are one of the things that we are looking at eliminating this year.
Fabulous. Good to hear. A couple questions from the chat. First of all, we had a question. How does Head Start fit into this model?
You want to take that, Jamie, or do you want me to, or Audrey?
I was going to give it to Audrey, to be honest.
Well, so first of all, we do have several Head Start programs that we partner with as well as ECAP. I personally think this is when we look at all these competing regulations, licensing and 619, some of the Head Start regulations I think are the best for any child in the country to follow. They have that holistic wraparound approach from addressing sitting with families for family style or family goal setting, working with children on family style meals, even looking at taking children to make sure they have updated physicals. So when we talk about the healthiest children in Delaware, those standards embrace it. So in our state, I know we talk a lot about more investments into ECAP programming. That's where
Audrey, can you define ECAP?
Well,
or just tell us what.
So it's
the letters mean.
typically a set of regulations for students that have at-risk factors, such as live 130% below the poverty guidelines, might come from a single family home. So for us in a district, we look at, funding is only typically available for students with special needs. Even that funding is not adequate, but we're working at the state level to adjust that, which is fabulous. And that's a funding opportunity we have that our child cares and partners do not have. So when they talk about purchase of care funds or tuition funds, we don't always take advantage of that, although we do have some districts that do. Indian River does not, but we have our unit count funding. So essentially for every 20 children with special needs, for every 12 children we have with special needs, we gain a teacher. But then when you talk about that, you want inclusion practices of putting 12 children that are typical peers in that, you can now see that you have 24 children with one teacher. And again, these are our smallest and youngest students, and it doesn't account for the ratios or the physical, the therapies they need. But we also have an advantage for a district to take some ECAP slots and work with that. And that is, I see Caitlin's kind of response in there. Yes, they are advocating for some state funded seats. And this is essential because it does help target our underserved, underrepresented areas for our neediest students that just need a hand up in a sense of that educational setting.
Thank you. That was terrific. I like that. Also, one other question, Caitlin, we had from the chat for you was how do parents find out about, or how do the community and parents find out where to find help if their children have special needs? Say a parent, it's their first child, they think the child has special needs. How do?
I think that it depends on where you're located, and depends on the resources that are available in your district. If you are in childcare, usually the path forward is through Child Development Watch. They will assess the children. We are also really close to Nemours, a stone's throw. So, and we will also use them. But there, I mean, that is probably one of the big things, and I will not speak for Caitlin, who's on this call. She hasn't even started her role yet, but I
Yeah.
know that this has been a discussion, not just how do we get services for families with special needs, but how do all families get the services that they are entitled to in
Yes.
general. And right
Yes.
now that is 211 is a great place to start. And your pediatrician's office is also a great place to start. And I think that what we are working towards is having a one-stop landing page for parents, because I know, my kids are 12 and 14 now, but I know that I missed out on a lot of things
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
we could have had and didn't. So, and that is not a socioeconomic difference, whether it's a low income, high income, middle income family. The lack of information for parents in how to get services for your child is just there.
The state
Thank you.
also passed a bill last session that requires all childcare facilities to provide developmental screenings, and that is a way that we can, for at least the children that are in settings, identify those. And we have
Yeah.
obviously talked
And
about
Neil,
that.
that's what I was going to add. I
Not
think
everyone's
that
in a
has-
setting.
I think I was going to add that. I think that has made a huge impact. And that's where I think the state is doing a great job at working with all the community partners to change legislation that supports everyone in this work. So requiring that universal screener, and right now, and I don't know how our child cares feel about this, but I can tell you that I think it's enhanced certainly the conversation. But all of our child carers in our community complete that screener. They used to do that in single silos. It comes to the Indian River School District, for example, and we put them in virtual classrooms. We can have conversations about children, and then we can provide additional supports and services, or even an evaluation needed. We do talk to our child carers, and our next step would be to also work with our community pediatricians to say, this is our process. This is what it looks like. So definitely that universal screening, I think has certainly helped parents navigate the world of early learning a little bit better.
Thank you. Good to hear. Neil, you want to tell us what we can do?
Sure, I would love to. And I see that there are questions in the chat about like, what's the status of things? I will just say big picture. We are very fortunate to have so many childcare providers and community advocates like yourselves who are rallying together around a common, ask every year. And we have receptive, responses from members of the legislature, but advocacy really works. If you show up and you raise your voice and you write that op-ed or you send that email. I used to work in the General Assembly. I know that they count the number of emails and phone calls that they get. And so your voice really does matter here. And I just want you to hear that and know that as we talk about the things that are to come. So let me share my screen again. I want to give you all a preview of an event that Daisy and Rodell have been working on. Daisy, how many years, Jamie, have you all had an advocacy day? It's got to be going on at least a 10 or a dozen now, it feels like.
I think it's at least 10.
Yeah.
I'm not 100% certain on that, so don't quote me, but yeah.
But this will be our second virtual advocacy day, and so it hopefully will be easy for people to participate. Jamie dropped the link to sign up in the chat. I will also drop the link to an email campaign that advocates are using to contact the key members of the legislature to talk about the importance of childcare. Madeline and others have talked about the long-term vision of getting to a place where, we're investing like a public good with higher rates and everyone has access. We know that's going to take a while to get to. In the meantime, we're coming to legislators with a short-term ask this year to improve purchase of care. And I don't know, Jamie, if there's anything else you'd want to say about that. If not, I can sort of talk about sort of purchase of care ask this year, but
I'm happy to talk about the purchase of care. So the Purchase of Care program has been historically underfunded. We are really working to separate the conversation on the need for increased purchase of care funding from the pandemic. We know that the pandemic brought people full of financial problems in the childcare world. And the state did a great job to make sure that childcare remained open and remained whole during the pandemic. However, now we need to focus on the problem that has been here for years. We are still not meeting the 2011 federal recommendations. We are below them. The federal recommendation is that we meet the 75th percentile of our market rate. We are still well below what it should be, and that is what we are advocating for, in that there is 11.5 million that is in potential ongoing and sustained funding, but we want to ensure that that is ongoing and sustained, and we know that it's not enough. So when people say, well, what is enough? What we need right now for 2022 is $40 million to band-aid the existing program. That doesn't make any future advancements. That doesn't get us really much more than we already have, but what it does is it allows providers to pay staff more. It allows providers to meet the quality requirements that are coming down or that already exist in the state but want to better their quality. It also helps providers make sure that, you know, their capital expenses are taken care of so that children are in safe and healthy environments. This also ensures that children with special needs get the extra funding that they are entitled to have. And this is where, you know, we really need to look. This also prioritizes geographic parity, so that Kent and Sussex and Newcastle, we are a small state. There is no need for a geographic difference, so that we are all getting reimbursed. And this also prioritizes infant and toddler care. So we really want to make sure that we incentivize providers to take infants and toddlers, because we know it's so much more expensive. And that is pretty much, I think, Neil, is quickly in 30 seconds as I can describe the advocacy ask for purchase of care.
Well, and I'm sure that some of the stories you heard today from the providers on the call are resonating with all of you. And so you think of yourselves, you know, as messengers now. You've heard from the providers, and you can speak from your own perspective about why this matters for your family, for your community. If you've sent a letter in the past, it does not hurt to send a follow-up letter. Personalize it to say, legislators, I know you're heading into, you know, the time when you begin to write the budget. I know, you know, there's an advocacy day coming up, and I want you to be aware of this. If you can't attend Advocacy Day on the 7th, that email campaign will be open for the next month while legislators begin to craft the budget. Jamie, can you give people a sense on the 7th of what they might expect if they're able to attend for the whole day, and sort of what they'll learn?
Sure, absolutely. So I think, you know, what you'll learn is more detail and more information on what we can go to our legislators for, and to make sure that we can articulate to the members of the Joint Finance Committee why this is important. We can also articulate that to our friends and neighbors, which is probably the most important thing of advocacy, is growing that voice and growing a larger coalition. The panel discussion will have both statewide and local legislators here in Delaware. And we will also get to hear from the National Association for the Education of Young Children, Director of Policy, Largan Hogan, to see how Delaware fits in the framework nationally, and not just what we're doing here. Because there are things that we are doing well, and that is not to be glossed over. And we shouldn't, we should definitely congratulate ourselves for those, knowing that we can always get better. As Audrey said earlier, there's always room for improvement, and we have a long way to go. The other thing is we will be meeting with legislators both on Advocacy Day and after Advocacy Day. And it is really important that we hear from folks who live in the geographic areas where the Joint Finance Committee is. So if you don't know who the Joint Finance Committee is, I will look that up and plop it into the chat as well. But we need to make sure that they know that their constituents and our voters in Delaware think that this is something that they need to prioritize. And we will be working from April 7th through June 30th, when the budget is signed, to make sure that they at least hear from us, and hopefully know that their decisions today affect the children of Delaware's future for decades to come.
So I will provide the slides so you can all click on the links here, including the great op-ed that Christine wrote in the Cape Gazette, and kudos to you, Christine, for that. If anyone has questions about this, I put my email address on here. I'm sure, Jamie, you can leave yours in the chat. And Sean and Audrey, if you are open to others following up to ask you questions, I encourage you to do the same if you'd like. But that's it from us in terms of the panel. You've heard sort of the state of the industry from a 10,000 foot perspective, then also from providers. You've heard some ways to get involved, and happy to follow up with anybody that wants to learn more after the fact.
Thank you to all. We really enjoyed it. It was terrific. Thank you.